Lighten up your touch, unclench your hand, straighten up your spine, take command, open up your eyes, find your smile, ready, set, go, it's a brand new mile. It's a brand new mile, a brand new day. Follow your heart and be on your way. Pull your shoulders back, lift your chin, take a breath, time to begin. Hold your head up high, feel the power flow. It's a brand new mile, ready, set, go. It's a brand new mile, a brand new day. Follow your heart and be on your It's a brand new mile, a brand new day. Follow your heart and be on your way. It's a brand new mile, a brand new day. Follow your heart and be on your way. Follow your heart and be on your way.
Tea conversation today with the amazing Cindy Blackstock and hosted by Faye Brunning. Your Ballad of the Famous Five and the Spirit of the Famous Five, of course, will always have special places in my heart. But this song is so comforting and so encouraging. It deserves us. It deserves special attention by us, and I'm really pleased we played it today. And at the end of the program, we're going to have another Canadian singer-songwriter, Jeanette Arsenault, also encourage us, also inspire us by singing her song, Women of the World. So welcome, bienvenue. I see many of you are already connecting or chatting in the chat room, and that's wonderful. Continue. Canada needs all of us to build a better country. And we can only do so if we know about each other and we care about each other. And by chatting in the chat room, you can encourage Cindy, you can encourage Faye, you can encourage the other women that you're meeting there so that together we build a better country. Because we're also treaty people. Many of us, of course, are persons, but we're also treaty people. And we are expressing our gratitude today and a little later again for the sisters and brothers, the girls and boys who have taken care of our land and share it with us today. We have an extra responsibility, being treaty people, to help fulfill the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So there's more work for us to do, but it is a joy to do, and it is important to do. And you can find links on our website so that you join with Cindy and the other people who are coming together to fulfill these very important recommendations. On behalf of my Famous Five board colleagues, and particularly our Director of Events, Preeta Kalar, and especially the Ottawa Famous Five chapter who organized this event today, welcome. So next Monday is International Women's Day. It started 110 years ago in North America, but it had been happening in other countries prior to that, to bring attention to the conditions in which women were working. And in 1908, 15,000 women marched down the streets to New York because just a few days previously, horrible working conditions had led to the death of hundreds of women. And so these women marched and established International Women's Day as a day to call attention to the conditions that women work in and to work to improve them. Now, just 2 years ago, the Canadian federal government adopted the Pay Equity Act, and it is now part of our Human Rights Commission, which is led by a fierce, phenomenal woman. But the pay equity section also has its own commissioner by the name of Karen Jansen. So if you have any issues, do contact the Canadian Human Rights Commission in the pay equity section, because statistics show that women are still paid only 88% of what a man is paid for a job of equal worth, of equal value. And that has to stop. And then, of course, with International Women's Day, there's also gender equity, gender parity. So a number of issues that we need to tackle, just like the Famous Five Foundation did many years ago. They gathered 3 or 4 women together and they became a dozen and they became hundreds. And as a result, Canadian women have the right to vote, run for office, and be declared persons. And we're very grateful to them, and of course to their daughters and granddaughters who've helped the Famous Five Foundation over the past 20 years. Also helping us has been a corporate sponsor, Enbridge. For the last 20 years, Enbridge has sponsored our leadership lunches in Ottawa, Sarnia, Edmonton, Fort McMurray, and Calgary, and now is our presenting sponsor for these virtual pink teas. So our thanks to Enbridge. And they have very graciously relinquished their position to introduce our very special panel so that a young mentee from the Ottawa Famous Five chapter can do so. And her name is Jennifer Hong, and I'm very pleased to introduce Jennifer. She's a second generation Vietnamese Chinese Canadian, born in Vancouver and raised by strong and independent women who also are of good heart. Her mother and her grandmother were exceptional entrepreneurs and very humble leaders. So Jennifer said it's those examples and the examples of others like the Famous Five that have inspired her to work hard, to set a big goal, and then to express her gratitude and help others to achieve their goals. Jennifer graduated from UBC, the University of British Columbia, just last year with a BSc, a Bachelor's of Science honors in force science. And she was also asked when the graduation happened last June 2020 to be the class valedictorian. Now, Jennifer is starting her career, and this first job is with National Resources Canada. She's based out of Ottawa, but now because of the situation, she's back in Vancouver. And one of her responsibilities is to help create a social media program to help women reintegrate the profession, their careers, because it's very difficult for women to do so. Jennifer likes to think about how to build communities and to make change on a really broad scale. So I'm very pleased, and Enbridge is too, that it's Jennifer Hong who's going to be introducing our esteemed panelists today. So Jennifer, over to you, and thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Hong, a member of the Famous Five Ottawa Mentorship Cohort, speaking to you from Vancouver. I acknowledge that I'm joining this virtual event on unceded and traditional Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. I acknowledge those who have come before us, those who are not present, and those who will come after us on these territories. I invite you to also take the time to acknowledge the traditional land you're now on. Today, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Cindy Blackstock, a member of the Gitxsan First Nation. She's dedicated over 30 years to child welfare and Indigenous children's rights. That's not only a testament to her impactful work as a nation builder, but also a clear example of how the values and legacies of the Famous Five transcend time. The women of the Famous Five were instrumental in their ability to address structural inequalities and imbalanced policies by making their points of view clear and central to political discussions of the day. Cindy's work does just that. And not only is the story of her work significant, but you might be interested to know how she got into her line of work as well. Cindy grew up in the Huckleberry Fields of northern BC and was inspired by Patrick Overton's poem, Faith. It made her realize that someone needed to address the inequalities faced by Indigenous children and families in Canada. Fast forward a few decades, and now, Cindy isn't only a household name, but a hero to many children. She's been described as the relentless moral voice for First Nations equality because she challenged the federal government's provision of child and family services, leading to the historic implementation of Jordan's Principle. She's also the co-founder and executive director of the National First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Cindy, it's an incredible honor for me to have you here joining us today, as you've been instrumental in your work advocating for Indigenous children and their rights. I'm sure I speak for many of us in the room when I say that I find your work truly inspiring as a person who wins with dignity, is a mountain of power, and who does her work with hope. It's clear that your continuous efforts have been monumental in paving the way for building community and holding Canada accountable to its commitment to truth and reconciliation. You've brought your personal experiences, outrage about inequality, passion and resilience to address systemic barriers, resulting in measurable impacts for hundreds of thousands of Indigenous children. You give us all faith that change is possible and empower us to critically think about how we can continue to address inequalities in our own communities. We honor you as a nation builder and are excited to hear your story today. So it's my sincere pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Cindy Blackstock. Joining Cindy today is our facilitator, Faye Brunning. Faye is a founding member of the Famous Five Ottawa chapter and was instrumental in the establishment of their outreach program. Faye's story starts on a farm in Hudson Bay, Saskatchewan, and brings her here today as a civil litigation lawyer who's practiced for 32 years in Ottawa. Like Cindy's concerns for addressing inequalities, Faye was motivated to become a lawyer to help address individual inequalities in accessing justice. She's appeared in trial and appeal courts and before tribunals and worked in numerous legal organizations that strive to improve the Ontario justice system. In 2011, Faye was asked to represent Indigenous peoples in the James Bay region with child abuse claims under the residential school settlement agreement. Since then, she's met with hundreds of residential school survivors, their families, and Indigenous leaders, and has taken part in ongoing court proceedings to enforce Indigenous rights. Faye, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, Jennifer. Thank you so much for that very lovely introduction for both Cindy and myself. And I certainly wish you ongoing success in your path to leadership, because that's pretty certain, listening to your tremendous speaking ability today and your thoughtfulness. Thank you. And I also like to say thank you to Frances Wright. Frances inspired me over 25 years ago to get involved in the Famous Five Foundation, and she still inspires me today. And I got involved because I wanted to find other women who were seeking equality for women and for people who needed the benefit of human rights law. And I'd like to thank the over 300 people who are attending this event today, and we are very grateful. And we'd ask you all to open your hearts and your minds and listen today to understand how discrimination is happening in our country, Canada, today, and what it takes for that to be eliminated. Special acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the Algonquin people and their culture upon whose lands I live and work. I'd like to specially acknowledge the St. Anne survivors. I have had the benefit of them educating me and of them trusting me to understand their truths. And I would also like to mention that in terms of the Persons Day case, as a lawyer, one of the things that really inspired me about the Persons case is, of course, the living tree principle, and that our Constitution is not something to be defined as to what happened 150 years ago. It's a living tree, and we must move forward with what the definition of person is. And unfortunately, in 1929, when matters went before the Privy Council in England, and the highest court in all the Commonwealth made the great pronouncement and said, yes, women are persons, the definition of persons did not include Indigenous women at that time. And from that, I think we all have to strive towards ensuring that everyone is included in the definition of persons as we move forward as a country. And so with that, what I want to do is introduce you and say hello to one of my heroes currently as a human rights activist and an advocate. It's Cindy Black, and from the Caring Society here in Ottawa. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here. And I too join you from unceded Algonquin territory. And may I say, Jennifer, congratulations on your graduation. And I too went to UBC, and my first job was picking pine cones when I was 4 years old for reforestation. So we already have a lot in common, and I'm really looking forward to meeting you in person one day.
Lovely. So Cindy, you're a national and you're an international hero for many, including myself, and you're a human rights advocate for First Nation children. We all thank you for what you're doing for the First Nations children and continue to do, and opening the eyes of non-Indigenous Canadians to what our world actually looks like through the lenses of a First Nations child and their families. And just for the audience's benefit, starting in 2007, I understand that you and the Assembly of First Nation, you filed a complaint to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and after 9 long years of litigation, you were successful, and a landmark win for First Nation children in January 2016 from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, who found that there was in fact racially based discrimination against First Nation children in Canada. And you won that battle, but the battle continues today, I understand, 5 years later, and there's still a lot of feet dragging going on. And what's the current status of your endeavors, and what's the Spirit Bear plan? Could you tell us that?
Sure. So just for your viewers, some people are not aware that the federal government funds all public services on reserve and has done so to inequitable levels dating back to Confederation. And we really feel that's unfair. Getting to your point about the persons case, I mean, these children are persons. They should not have to fight for the basic public services like clean water and adequate opportunities to get proper health care and to stay with their families. But that, in fact, is exactly what happened in this case. Because Canada knew it was underfunding these services by about 30% compared to other children, and that does not account for the children's higher needs because of residential schools. And yet they fought against it. They just simply did not want to pay these children the public services that they require. And so that landmark ruling was really an important step. It was about making sure that this generation of children doesn't have to recover from their childhoods. It's really, really basic. It's about providing them an equitable opportunity to live the lives they wish to have. The government welcomed that decision, and then they didn't implement it. And so now I think we're up to about 9 non-compliance orders from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And keep in mind, this is on the heels of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where the government actually adopted all of those calls to action, and child welfare and Jordan's Principle are among the top 3 calls to action. It just really shows you how difficult it is to get governments to really just treat these children fairly. And that's where the Canadian public really needs to get on board with this, because governments don't create change, they respond to change.
You know, and Cindy, I guess if you'll permit me for the listeners, I just want to review a little bit too about residential school and the settlement agreement and promises of truth and reconciliation. For over 100 years in Canada, Indigenous children were taken away from their parents and placed in residential school, which was enforced by the police and by Indian agents and by church officials. And so children were not raised by their parents. They were required to adopt foreign religion, foreign languages, foreign ways, and parents weren't allowed to raise their own children, nor teach them their own culture. And then, of course, unfortunately, there was widespread abuse of the children in those schools. And the last residential school did not close until 1996. This is not particularly historic, it's current. And for instance, in the James Bay region, where I've been focusing my time and skills, is that everyone up there at age 50 and over went to residential school. And so can you help us? Do you think that the governments of today are repeating the residential school mistakes of the past for First Nation children? And if so, how?
Well, I think as people, we understand that when we mess up, our first job is not to apologize. Our first job is to understand the harm that we created from the perspective of those that were harmed. And then to do everything we can to make things right, and to make sure that we put in place the learnings and the changes in our behavior so that we don't repeat that wrongdoing. What's happened in terms of the federal government on residential schools later the 60s scoop, and indeed in our case, is that learning has not happened. These apologies have been free flowing, and then this very modest compensation for lost childhoods. But they haven't learned inside of the government itself to reform the government sufficiently so that the discrimination and the harm does not continue. In fact, you referenced earlier the Spirit Bear plan. Well, it's a very simple plan, Faye. It's about costing out all the inequalities. Many of your listeners will remember the Auditor General's report just of last week about there are communities here who have not had clean water in 25 years. Mm-hmm. So for your listeners, think about how many times today you're going to turn on your tap. And imagine if you're in a family where that wasn't possible. And you're trying to manage the pandemic. Well, that's the reality. So Spirit Bear plan is, let's cost out all of those inequalities and then launch something like a Marshall Plan to eliminate all those inequalities so that we no longer have this racial discrimination in the provision of public services. It was adopted by the Gitxsan Assembly in 2017. The government has refused to implement it. The other part of the Spirit Bear plan is for the government to actually have an evaluation, an independent evaluation, to find out why it isn't doing better when it knows better for children. That's a nut we really have to crack. Is governments are very keen to reform everybody else, but what's really required in this instance is for them to reform themselves.
And it's not just the politicians, right, Cindy? I mean, we've had, different political parties that come in, but in fact, Indigenous people in Canada they're governed under the Indian Act, which in and of itself is a terribly racist piece of legislation. But inside the departments of, which is now called CIRNAC, it used to be Aboriginal Affairs, and also I think in the Department of Justice, there are officials that have been there throughout all of these movements to try and make change, but perhaps there hasn't been systemic change. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and just for clarification, the Indian Act applies to First Nations. But I really recommend everybody actually get on Google, type in Indian Act and look at the table of contents. You're going to find that it actually makes a judgment on a baby about whether they're status or non-status. Imagine a judgment on a baby that they're non-status. It can overturn your wills and estates. It deals with your own property ownership, all kinds of things that touch your daily lives. And the government has not done that, eliminated the Indian Act, even though the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples 20 years ago provided a pathway forward. Now, you may be saying, well, we need it. Well, we don't need it because every other Western industrialized country has gotten rid of it. And a lot of folks don't know that the Indian Act was actually a template for apartheid South Africa. The reserve system, the status card system, all of that was imported there. And we rose up as a collective against apartheid in South Africa. And yet we were all pretty comfortable and almost normalized hearing the words Indian Act flowing from the radio stations or walking by the Department of Indian Affairs. I just think it's a huge injustice that that act continues to be a dark stain on humanity in this country.
It certainly is. It certainly is, Cindy. Now, for the listeners, Dr. Blackstock has amazing academic credentials. And as she's been growing in her work, she's also been adding to her formal education to develop additional skills that she keeps applying to help this country get to a better place. Cindy, you've got a doctorate in social work from the University of Toronto, Masters of Law in Children's Law and Policy from Loyola University, Chicago, Masters in Management from McGill, Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, University of British Columbia. You've had academic appointments. You're right now, I understand, professor at McGill University, School of Social Work. And listen, folks, she's had academic appointments at University of Alberta, Toronto, Dalhousie, Ottawa, Victoria, Manitoba. Plus, she has 21 honorary doctorate degrees. Now, Cindy, that takes a lot of energy and a lot of ongoing commitment and passion on your part. And, you know, a lot of people wonder, where do you find and sustain your ongoing ability to do this? And maybe you could explain to us who's Jordan River Anderson and what does he mean to you?
You know, I think in each of our lives, if you're really blessed, we all are given an opportunity to do something that's greater than ourselves. And I have really been blessed to be able to do that. And that has driven my search for kind of knowledge. I am so blessed to be part of a collective movement started by people many generations before I came along to address this discrimination. But I've felt that I've had an opportunity to often overcome my own insecurities. You remember that Jennifer talked about that poem from Patrick Overton. Well, the line that comes to me always is that when you step across that place where light leads into darkness, there'll be something solid to stand on or you'll be taught to fly. Many of us are presented with an opportunity to make a difference in the world, but we often feel like we're not the right person. I certainly felt that way. I felt I wasn't smart enough. There's got to be someone else out there who knows what they're doing. I didn't know what I was going to be doing. There's got to be somebody else out there. But the reality is we're all everyone else's best hope. And even if you step across that place where light leads into darkness and you fail, you've at least shown someone that you love them enough to try. And that is an important signal to send. For Jordan River Anderson, he was a little boy in Norway House Cree Nation in northern Manitoba. He was born in 1999 to a loving family. He had some medical needs and he stayed in hospital for 2 years. Now, for those of you who have children in your lives, you know how stressful that can be when you have a child who's that ill and how you're so excited when the day comes and doctors say you can go home, right? That day came for Jordan. But because he was a First Nations child, Canada said, whoa, hold on a minute. He has at-home care needs. The province of Manitoba should pick up some of those things. And even if it is the federal government, we got all these different departments. So maybe Health Canada should pay for part of it, or Indian Affairs should pay for part of it. And what they chose to do is leave him in a hospital while they argued over literally every individual thing that he needed to be able to live in a family home. And I want to be crystal clear about this. If he was a child of any other cultural heritage, he would have gone home. The government of Manitoba would have picked up those services. And little Jordan was in the hospital. His doctors, his family, his community were writing to the government saying, just let this little guy go home, figure out these arguments later. And they wouldn't do it. And so as the sister Geraldine Anderson says, Jordan in the end He died of a broken heart just before his 5th birthday. He slipped in a coma after waiting 2.5 years in that hospital ward. And Jordan's principle is a gift from Jordan's spirit and his family. And Jordan's principle is very simple. It says, where a government service is required by a First Nations child, they ought to receive it when they need it, free of any discrimination because they're First Nations. It was adopted in the House of Commons in 2007. And then the government created a definition of it that was so narrow that the government's official position was that no children ever qualified. And that meant that children were being denied, in some cases, things like feeding tubes, Faye. We had children who were denied hospital beds in order that they could not go into respiratory distress and not suffocate. And all of this, the government was denying on the basis of what they viewed as our public interest. And they would talk about how they were getting criticized by the Canadian Medical Association, by First Nations, by others. And they would just say, well, you know, we're defending the public interest. And I thought to myself, I see a lot of protests up in Ottawa for a variety of things on government policy. I can't imagine anyone protesting giving a 4-year-old little girl who's in hospice care access to a bed, a hospital bed, so she does not suffocate while she hospices at home. That's exactly the kind of thing we want our tax money to go to. Exactly. And in the middle of this, actually, the government of Canada awarded those bureaucrats one of the highest awards in the government in 2011 for being able to fend off all of these critiques and fail to implement the services. So that's just a real life example that the racism is so embedded in the government that it's not just normalized, it's award-winning.
Right.
And that's why the tribunal's intervention was so important. We knew that talking to them was not going to be enough. They needed to face an order to change that behavior.
And even Shannon Kustashian as well from Attawapiskat. I mean, an extraordinarily young woman, and she was fighting for equal access to education. And you met Shannon before she.
I did. I remember meeting Shannon Kustashian. I was on Victoria Island, for those of you who know Ottawa. And she was with a group of children from her community. Attawapiskat is about 1,200 kilometers north of Toronto. It's a wonderful Cree community with a rich culture. Most of the children are fluent in Cree, and then their second language is English. But the children in that school, their school was built on a toxic waste dump of over 30,000 gallons of diesel fuel. And it was making the children sick. And so the government of Canada took down the school and brought up these portable trailers. And it was supposed to be temporary, but they put the trailers right on the playground of that contaminated site. So the children were still getting sick. And over time, this temporary measure became a long-term measure. So by the time Shannon Kustashian was on Victoria Island, advocating for what she called safe and comfy schools, those portable trailers had rodent issues. There was about 4 to 6 inches of ice on the inside of the doors. There was black mold. They didn't have a library. They didn't have a science lab. And these children wanted to, as Shannon says, grow up and be someone important. So she, throughout her entire childhood, was part of a campaign led by the youth in Attawapiskat to try and get a safe and comfy school, because these kids wanted to grow up and be important people. They wanted the same opportunities other kids did. And the government of Canada kept on saying, we don't have the money. And Shannon then came down to Ottawa to make that plea in person to to the political leadership here in Canada. And she got the same response, we don't have the money. And I remember what she said. She said, I don't believe you. And school's a time for dreams, and every kid deserves this. And I will never give up. And she was true to her word. When she was 13, she had to move away from her community because there wasn't a high school there. She wanted to grow up to be a human rights lawyer to defend the education rights of all children. And so she moves away. And sadly, it was on her way back to school, hundreds of miles away from her community, on a night that she was in an automobile accident, and we lost Shannon Kustashian in 2010. But in her activism, she inspired thousands of children to write letters to the government for safe and comfy schools. And so her legacy is Shannon's dream. And although, there's a new school in Attawapiskat, thanks to her work and those of the other youth, that school is still not equitably funded. And there are many First Nation schools across this country that are really, frankly, in deplorable condition. So it's something that, I know these inspiring kids, but imagine having to spend your childhood, as Shannon did, fighting with the government to try and convince them that you're worth the money.
Well, and what's ironic, Cindy, about it too, is that right next to Attawapiskat was a massive De Beers, a diamond mine, and millions and millions and millions of dollars were paid to the federal government in royalties. And those are lands that were taken from the Attawapiskat First Nation, and they derived very little revenue from that. And so at the same time that they were pulling in those royalties, they were claiming they didn't have money to build a school right there. So it's it is tragic, especially, for people like Shannon and Jordan who lose their lives. But I appreciate the fact that you help bring forward this so that their lives are not in vain. And if we can ask you, many of the people who've registered today are interested to know a bit about your own childhood. And as we know, you're a member of the Gitxsan First Nation in Northern British Columbia. I understand that's north of the Yellowhead Highway before you get to.
It's a Hazelton area, so between Prince George, for those who know Northern BC, and Terrace, so right in there.
And Cindy, I'm forgive me, I'm reading from the screen above, but you've been described as others as ethical and honest, kind and thankful, respectful and conciliatory. You have great integrity. You're courageous, you're unflappable and calm, and you have an unwavering commitment to First Nations children. And tell us, if you could, a little bit about your childhood. Did you go to residential school, for instance? And what about your own Indigenous status? How did that affect you as a child?
Well, I didn't go to residential school because I grew up in the bush, thankfully. So in the bush, there were no Indian agents plowing around. I grew up in a time when there were lookout towers. I know I'm aging myself here with the forest fire thing. So that's why, my first job at 4 years old was picking pine cones. I think one of the things that I always am so blessed to have been taught from a very young age is it's not what you accumulate in life that matters. It's your ability to live your life in alignment with human values.
All right, I'm okay.
And so what was really important, taught to me at a very young age, is make sure that you start to really not only know, but practice honesty, that you practice, respect, that you practice all these other values, and that you develop the moral courage to defend it. Courage is not a value. Courage is an activator of values. And I was taught that values aren't just something you say, they're something that you are. And when you develop that over your lifetime, and there's my road has been far from perfect, I can tell you, many bumps in the road. But then you can face down something like the government of Canada, because they may be able to take your employment. They may be able to violate your privacy. They may be able to do many things to you. But if what you really value in your life is your ability to live your values and to give generously to others, they can never take that away from you. Only you can give that away to them. And I was never going to give that away for Canada. They are not worthy of that gift. And I just felt that I have to try my very best every day to wake up and live my life in a way that brings dignity to these children, these young people and families, people like Shannon Kustachin. So even when I'm having a crabby day, I think I have to pull up my socks so that, I don't embarrass Shannon, I don't embarrass Jordan, and that I keep the public's focus not on me, but on them.
Cindy, do you think that your life would be different if you would have been taken away from your parents from age 6 to 16 and not been able to be raised by your family or know your family as you were growing up as a child?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about residential schools, a lot of people don't know is that not only were you separated from your parents and your grandparents and everybody else, you're often separated from your siblings. by gender. So the boys were on one side and the girls on the other, and often you were punished for even like a wave. I remember Chief Bobby Joseph saying when he waved to his sister, the few times you get a glimpse of her, he was punished for that. So you can just imagine having your children removed from you and placed in institutions, often that are very abusive. And then seeing what kind of happens at the end. Many of these children and young people experience profound abuses that really, that they have to carry that with them. And that's the damage of what Canada is doing. It really is life-threatening and life-damaging.
And what about foster care then right now that, the massive number of foster children are Indigenous. And so is that not a repeat of some of those mistakes of the past?
Yeah, it is, because when we think about, I'm going to use First Nations here, and I really encourage us to be specific. I use First Nations because the data that we have is that First Nations children are 12 times more likely to be in foster care than other kids. And the reason is poverty, poor housing, caregiver substance misuse related to multi-generational trauma, and domestic violence. All of those things are responsive to services. But when you have inequalities across every service, that means that family problems that might be small to start with don't have the supports that are required in order to address them in the early stages, so things become a crisis. And then when things are a crisis, there aren't the same types of supports that everyone else takes for granted to be able to address those crises. So we actually have more First Nations children in child welfare care than we did at the height of residential schools. It really, I see people talking about IRS and they need to, they kind of feel it's over with, right? But for me, I see children every day who are continuing to experience this, and the tribunal made very clear that Canada's racial discrimination by providing inequitable services for First Nations kids today has resulted in thousands of unnecessary family separations and that contributed to the deaths of some children. That's right now. And I think that in Canada, we're just awakening to how normalized this racism is here. We really have is really an apartheid public service system. And I was so interested to see with that nutcase in the White House, I don't even like to say his name, the previous president, and how he was separating families at the Mexican border. Many Canadians were horrified, rightly so. But yet our own government is doing that same kind of behavior, and people find it much more difficult to see.
And I found that, some of the people I know well who went to residential school, they actually suffered post-traumatic stress disorder because when they watched that on television, it gave them back the feelings from when they were in residential school. And even, in terms of your point there, Cindy, I think it's important for people to realize that sometimes today, now, people who were severely abused as children in residential school, they continue to suffer the harms, and we're still not giving enough support to the people who went to residential school to be able to help them overcome some of the mental health problems that would naturally arise from that type of child abuse in schools with holy people who were not supposed to be doing that to begin with.
And for governments, I really recommend everyone, it's been named one of the 100 books everyone should read, is John Malloy's book, A National Crime. It tells the story of residential schools, not from the perspective of survivors, because the best resource for that is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But John Malloy's book, A National Crime, tells the story of residential schools from the perspective of the Government of Canada's own documents. And once you read that book, you're going to see that people of all walks of life throughout the decades knew what was happening in those schools was wrong, spoke out about it, but Canada repeatedly took the same action, which is to minimize, discredit, and not take the action needed to be able to save these children from the harms that are there.
And tell us about Dr. Peter Bryce.
Oh, he's one of my greatest heroes. He's one of those early people who stood up. He was the first medical health officer in Ontario. He wrote Ontario's first health code, which has been replicated across Canada and into the United States. At the age of 51, as president of the American Public Health Association, so a doctor of some esteem, he was appointed to be the chief medical health officer at the Indian Department. He was sent out by a guy named Duncan Campbell Scott to go and research the health of kids in residential schools. And what he found was shocking. The average death rate was about 25% per year. And if you track kids over 3 years, it could go rise as high as 70% of the children were dead. Now, what Bryce found is that the folks here in Ottawa, where you and I are, Faye, were receiving 3 times the amount of healthcare funding of all, quote, back then they calls Indians across Canada. And Bryce said, equalize out the healthcare funding. And then this will all sound familiar to all of us. Don't put sick people in with healthy people. Make sure there's ventilation and that the places are sanitary. And you could save the lives of thousands of these kids. So the government, he goes back to the government, tells them what needs to be done. It would cost about $10,000 to $15,000 of the $100 million national treasury. Canada says, no, we're not going to do it. Too expensive. And the result is that 4,000 to 6,000 children died needlessly in those schools. But Dr. Bryce was not satisfied with being told no by his employer. So his results actually end up in the Ottawa Evening Citizen newspaper and newspapers across Canada on the front page. And one of the persons reading that was a lawyer named Samuel Hume Blake in 1908. And he later became a judge and is actually the founder of Blake's law firm, which continues to go on today. He said that in that Canada failed to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nears of manslaughter. Canada retaliated against Dr. Bryce for speaking the truth, but Bryce kept on talking to the time of his death. He was erased from Canadian history, but thanks to the TRC, people are starting to know about his early example of real heroic pieces. And so he's buried over at Beechwood Cemetery. And I and folks like Marie Wilson from the TRC and John Malloy and Project of Heart, we put up historical plaques to really honor Dr. Bryce and to invite others to follow his example.
Thank you. Yes, a remarkable man, and I think he did that all in the face of backlash as well from federal bureaucrats who even took away his employment. Did they not?
Yeah, they did. They pushed him out of the federal public service,
Right.
but that didn't silence him. In 1922, he writes a pamphlet called A National Crime, and that's where John Malloy takes the title from his book from.
Right. And how did it feel as a complainant and then 15 days of being in the witness stand? How did it feel knowing that your testimony and what you were doing, you had over 150,000 First Nation children who really needed this to be proven in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal?
It was really nerve-wracking. I was the first witness in the case. I was on the stand for 5 days and then more days because Canada broke its disclosure obligations. But it was exactly that way, Faye, is that there are times in your life when you don't want to mess up for you. That's nothing compared to this. I knew that there were 150,000 sacred souls, and not only those children, but their descendants that depended on us getting this right. So it was a huge weight. And the other piece that was difficult is that when I was testifying, I was under what I call the cone of silence, which is you can't talk to your testimony with anyone. But you're reading these government documents and it, you know, you've heard the phrase, the banality of evil. It really is that. Like the dehumanized way in which these children were dealt with by the bureaucrats and by the politicians. And what was worse is that often the government made itself into the victim. Like people don't appreciate what we've done. Look at all the things we've done for First Nations kids, right? They use what they have done in defense of the equality that they continue to deny to First Nations children. And that was particularly sickening, to be honest, is to see them write, for example, about that little girl, the 4-year-old little girl who was deprived the hospital bed. It went through the hands of 15 different public servants before someone wrote on there, absolutely not, with an exclamation mark. Like, I'm a person who likes to believe in the goodness of people, but what that really showed me is that when you have systems where the morality of the person is displaced by loyalty to the system, i.e. I have to do what the system thinks I want in order to keep my job, in order to get promoted, in order to do good, the danger of all of that, right? And I would see it over and over again in a record. And that was the most difficult thing, is seeing how normalized this was, how people had shed their own humanity. I couldn't imagine somebody on the street saying absolutely not to a 4-year-old little girl who is in hospice. And yet that's exactly what they were doing in the federal government.
Thanks to people like you, Cindy, and others, small progress, small steps are being made. And I feel guilty about interrupting this spectacular discussion. So much learning, so much sadness. But also I keep telling myself, straighten your back, Francis, help Cindy, speak out, do something. And as you know, there are some spectacular young women who are coming after you, Cindy, because you have inspired them. And we have 2 of them today who have got a question for you. And I would ask you to keep your answer brief. It breaks my heart to ask you to keep your answer somewhat brief, but unfortunately we have time constraints. So I'm wondering if we might first hear from Lisha, who is from the Satina School, just southwest Calgary. So Lisha, over to you, please.
Hi, I'm Alicia Gottschalk. I'm in grade 7. I go to Chief Big Billy Middle School, and thank you for all that you've done. And my question is, how can I follow into your footsteps so I could help others? Please discuss.
Alicia. And I think one of the things that I really found to be helpful is to realize that all of us have a special gift. There's this great book called The Element that you can get by Ken Robinson. And what he talks about is that everyone has something that they're really good at and you're really passionate about. That could be music, it could be poetry, it could be mathematics, it could be planning, it could be listening to people. And what we all need to do is figure out what that thing is for us and then give it very generously to the world in the way that we make change. Because by gifting generously of that gift, then you're going to be able to maximize the output that you have. And you recognize those gifts in other people and encourage them to do the pieces that they have gifts for. And it becomes a communal movement into a process. The other thing is there's no substitute for really hard work, right? Behind every movement, there's a lot of hard work, and you have to do that in respect with other people and to keep at it until you make a difference. But I can already see from the short snippet that I was giving you that you have a lot of spunk and a lot of smarts and a lot of gifts. So read Ken Robinson's The Element, figure out what your gift is and give it generously.
Wonderful answer, Felicia. And now back to the serious side of things. We have a very impressive young woman from the Ottawa area, Shailene, to ask a question that's not only on her mind, but of course on the mind of hundreds of thousands of children, Cindy, and I know you're going to have the right answer for her. So Shailene, please.
Hello, Cindy Blackstock. My name is Shailene Unalowski. I got 3 kids. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta. My heritage is Cree, and my mother is from Pine House. It's a northern village located in the Borough Forest of Saskatchewan. I have experienced both cultural assimilation and cultural deprivation from the Indigenous community and my true cultural identity. Due to the lack of reliable information about my birth father and my mother's history being a victim of the 60s scoop, I am struggling to attain my status. What advice or guidance do you have for me to be successful in obtaining recognition of my status? Miigwech.
Well, it's a very good question. And the most important thing I should say is that really this Indian Act and colonialism has given rise to this whole question of, quote, who's a real Indian? The government of Canada makes these determinations on status and non-status. And they really are, there's been a lot of courageous women, for example, who have really advocated to eliminate discrimination in the Indian Act. But the whole Indian Act itself is discriminatory. I always say to young people, Unfortunately, the whirlwind of colonialism has affected too many of us, particularly people of my generation. And what we need to realize is that your identity as an Indigenous woman is sacred and valuable just for what it is. And that none of us have all the pieces. I don't know all the ceremonies. I don't know the language. I don't know a lot of things. But as my aunt told me, she said, you have it in your spirit and in your heart. And so own that and know that that's true. Don't ever question that you're not, quote, cultural enough. You can learn these things through positive relationships with people in the community. If you're struggling around how to navigate the Indian status thing, you're not alone. And actually, you can contact and talk to people in your First Nation to try and pin down some of the family connections that could help you with your application. And most First Nations have membership clerks. If you're really stuck, just email us at info@fncaringssociety.com and we'll do what we can to help. So that's the answer to that one.
That's a very helpful answer, and I'm sure you've given that answer thousands and thousands of times, Cindy. Hearing you today response to Faye's questions has been an education and an embarrassment and a sadness. But most of all, I hope it brings most of us closer to doing our part to fulfill the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations and to making all Canadians equal. So now it's my pleasure to invite Leisha just to bring a few words of thanks to you from her heart. Leisha?
Sieskas Dr. Blackstock for all that you've accomplished for our children of the First Nations and all of Canada. Hearing you today has inspired me. Sieskas.
Cindy.
No, there's not.
So with Spirit Beer, Mary and Huckleberry.
Mary and Huckleberry, there we are.
And they cheer up lots of people and inspire them to do their bit too. So since there's so many things, Cindy, in gratitude that we wish to express to you, but time being what it is, and we're at a tea party. So I know my buddies across Canada have brought their teacups. Oh, and a beautiful mug.
Yeah.
We would like to raise a toast to you, Cindy, for your incredible leadership, your inspiring leadership, your thoughtful leadership, your leadership that has made a difference and is going to make a difference because you're empowering us to go forward too. So a toast to a remarkable nation builder, to Cindy Blackstock.
And to all the children.
And to all the children.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Now, Cindy, our Ottawa chapter has decided they will make a generous donation to the Caring Society on your behalf, $500 that they have raised, so to help you in that way and in other ways too. McGill, Cindy, McGill. I don't know, is there mighty McGill a person could say to you? Something just a little extra. And of course, a toast please to our marvelous host who is not only bringing out the issues that Cindy has considered and achieved and is working on, but she too is taking action. So may we raise a glass of toast to Faye Brunning.
Thank you. And I just say for the listeners, if you're interested, please go to Cindy's website. And especially for children, if you look at the I Am a Witness program, where Cindy has done so much to help children understand what's going on and involve them in a very meaningful way in this legal process, please take a look at the website and the social media. You do a great job on that, Cindy, and it makes a difference, a big difference for children and teachers and all of us. Thank you.
Wow. And it's a thanks to all the children and everyone who has stepped across that place where light leads into darkness, that over 800,000 services have been given to First Nations children in Jordan's name since that legal order. So it is making a difference on the ground. We just need to keep going until they're treated properly and sacredly as they deserve.
And talking about children, our third toast of the day goes to Jennifer, to Leisha, and to Shailene. To our leechers to today and the future.
All the best.
And so I'm just going to ask our talented AV crew now to take Cindy and Faye off so they can just rest for a minute as we conclude with a few Famous Five Foundation announcements. As we are aware, we've just concluded Black History Month, and I hope some of the stories have come through to you about, for example, Marianne Shadd, a Canadian, being the end of the Underground Railroad. So Harriet was the beginning, and it was another woman, Marianne Shadd, in Lower Ontario, who was the end of the Underground Railroad. And then, of course, there's people like Rosemary Brown, who was an NDP MP from Vancouver, the first woman of color to be elected, and our own Gina Augustine, who is still working in Toronto, the first woman of color to be elected or to be chosen as a cabinet minister, and the leadership that she's providing and that others are coming along. And in one of our next virtual Pink Teas, we will have some of these amazing women of color who are leaders, so that we grow in that regard too. Just very quickly, our next Famous Five Fridays virtual Pink Tea is going to be with Pamela Jeffrey, who established the WXN network, the Women's Executive Network, which also established 100 Most Powerful Women and the Board Diversity Council. She and her friends are very worried about what COVID is doing to women, and particularly how it's impeding our progress. So she and 61 leaders from across Canada, CEOs and executive directors, have gotten together to establish the Prosperity Project. And we have that information again on our website and in the notice coming to you. But she's going to talk about what steps they are taking to mitigate the pressure of COVID to push women back. We can't have it. We have to keep going forward. And in May, it's going to be Beverly McLaughlin. Now, Beverly grew up in a log cabin in Southwest Alberta in Pincher Creek, no running water, no electricity. And of course, she goes on to be a best-selling author. No, sorry, Faye. She goes on to be the first woman to serve as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. So she's in May. So that's our lineup for the next 2 months. Again, such gratitude to Cindy, to Faye, and our 3 young Indigenous leaders. And our last toast is to each and every one of us, because as we spoke about previously, and Cindy said too, Canada needs all of us. So please raise your cup and say, to me, I'm a leader too. To me, I'm a leader too. So now it's time to hear from Jeanette Arsenault singing Women of the World, so that all over the world we recognize, appreciate, and are inspired by what women are doing to improve life for everyone. So Miigwech, mighty Miigwech, merci, thank you. We'll see you in April. The Famous Five legacy is within you. Bye-bye.
Hey, hey, hey there, woman. Hey, hey, hey there, girl. The time has come, there's work to be done. Come on, you women of the world.